Hello and welcome to the third in our series of conversations on how to have a healthy relationship with money, live from the offices of Charles Stanley in central London. Today our focus is on discussing money matters with loved ones. It's time to talk about money. Research for Charles Stanley has found that more than half of us are not comfortable discussing money with our families. But interestingly, 78% of those surveyed are comfortable discussing money with others. So what's the issue? Why the disconnect? After all, our nearest and dearest are the ones we should be most open with. So let's talk about it now with Tsitsi Mutiti. She's an investment manager at Charles Stanley on a self-declared mission to empower women in particular to be financially savvy. Welcome.
Thanks, Joanne.
And also with us, Paul Craven, behavioural economics expert. It's a subject area Paul describes as understanding how real people make real decisions in the real world. And Paul speaks from the perspective of having spent 30 years in asset management. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
And welcome to you wherever you're joining us from. As ever, this conversation is for you, so please do join in. Do share your thoughts, experiences, questions. You can get in touch via the chat box on your app that you're joining us via. So do please get in touch and we'll bring in your questions a little bit later. We've got plenty of time to bring those in. So Paul, first of all, what's going on? Why this disconnect? Why are people reluctant to talk to those closest to them about money?
It is almost a taboo. I think there's no doubt about that. And it's, by almost being a taboo, it's almost an anthropological thing rather than just a behavioural thing. It goes back, I think, many years. We're almost hardwired not to talk about money, certainly in the West. And I think there's a number of reasons why. First of all, it's become a kind of cultural, social norm. So if we see other people not talking about it, we won't do it ourselves. Now, why is that? Well, I think it's to do with privacy. The idea being I don't want to share what appear quite intimate details about my wealth with anybody else. I think a fear of judgment comes into it. In other words, if I have more than you or you have more than me, we might start judging each other. That's bad for society if that leads to conflict. It's an emotional issue. Yeah. Can't deny it. And finally, there's that sort of power issue. There's a hierarchy thing here as well. So those sort of 4 or 5 reasons have come together, I think, over a long period of time and actually made us uncomfortable about talking about money and wealth and investment, certainly in public. And it's sometimes harder to do those things because of those taboos with family members than it is with your peers who might be more helpful.
So it goes deep in us.
Yep, I think it's ingrained.
Is that what you've witnessed as well, Tsitsi, in your experience?
Certainly. I mean, working directly with clients, it's clear everything that Paul has said feeds into a lot of the relationships I've seen between family members, where maybe one person is the client and they're trying to bring in other family members. There's a tension of how do you even get that conversation started. And sometimes it is partly because the individual who may have the wealth, who wants to start that conversation, they have had some of these aspects that Paul has mentioned ingrained in them for a very long time. And how do you unravel that and start a new narrative with the next generation? It's certainly something that's really difficult to do. And I think the fact that emotions come into it makes it even harder.
It's an obvious question. Is this a particularly British thing?
No.
No, it's not. I'd have to say.
I thought it was.
No. Okay. We might be quite good at it, but no, it's not. I think it's certainly a Western thing. I think in the East, people are a little bit more comfortable at talking about it. And countries like China, it's traditional to say give red envelopes full of money to people on their birthdays and things, for children particularly. But I think it's a general thing in the West.
I think it is. I guess there's varying degrees. I'm originally from Zimbabwe and we don't talk about money. And in Africa, we don't even talk about not talking about money that much, So
like
whereas in the West, we're talking about not talking about money. So I think it's varying degrees. And as we develop, maybe we recognize that there is more of a need. Certainly from the research, we're seeing that more people are having those conversations. It's now a question of, well, at least here in the UK and from the sample that we've surveyed. But the question is, who are they having those conversations with, and do we need to open those conversations up more?
Yeah.
Sorry, there's I think there's a, forgive my pronunciation, there's a Nordic word, or jantelagen, which is, we don't really have a translation of that over here, but it kind of means that you shouldn't say things by which you might judge yourself to be better or worse than other people. And I think that comes at this idea of hierarchy and power, and I think this applies to money. Because I understand the Scandinavians, certainly my friends, never talk about money in quite the sort of same open way that some of my friends from the East might.
I like that. So having a word to describe the concept means that it's there in the psyche to be conscious of, to reflect on.
Yeah, you shouldn't see yourself as better than someone else, certainly not because of money reasons. And it's an interesting idea.
I'm wondering whether there's also a generational difference, because there's a lot of stuff, or increasingly stuff, on social media where young influencers are talking about it. So I thought we'd take a little look at a clip and see what you think about that.
Okay. So this is how I spent my £40,000 salary in January whilst living in Manchester. So after tax, national insurance, pension and student loan contributions, it gives me £2,350 to spend. So for rent, I spent £600 for the month, including bills. That's fairly cheap, but I am living in a house share. For food, I spent £220 for the month. For going out, I spent £385. Now that's fairly big for this month, but it was New Year's Eve. For fuel, I spent £170 for the month. For insurance, I spent £50 for the month. Subscriptions, like gym memberships, that's £60. And other was £385. That was a big dental bill that I wasn't expecting. So that gave me a total to invest of £480 for the month. Not great, but...
So what do you think? Someone being really open there, is that healthy?
There are some surveys that show that the younger generation is much better than the older generations about talking about money, and I think that's a really healthy thing, hopefully. Obviously, it's more immediate now with social media making it that possible. And I think it's progress.
We can have a sense sometimes that other people know what they're doing and we don't. And do you think that's an issue? If someone's worried about what's going on with their finances, they're even less likely to talk about it on the basis that they think everyone else is empowered and knows what they're doing, and there's a sense of shame around that.
Yeah, I think so. And it goes back to the judgment piece that, you know, if I approach someone, whether it's a professional or a family member or a friend, what will they say or what will they think about me? And you see it a lot with people who are dealing with debt. Sometimes, you know, they'll be thinking that if I go approach someone, the first question is, how did you even get into that debt? And not,
which it might well be. So we
yes,
have to be
it might be.
conscious of how we respond when
exactly.
someone says something, yeah.
This is the thing. So I think when it comes to the conversation, both parties have to be very open-minded and willing to listen. You know, the person who's taking the issue, whether it's a problem or they're talking about, you know, I'm thinking about passing on my wealth to the next generation. And these are some of the things I'm thinking about, but also the person receiving that information has to be willing to listen and hear what's being said before they start making a comment.
It also helps to explain why, if you're, say, a 20-something, you might be much more comfortable talking with a fellow 20-something using social media or TikTok or whatever it may be, than you might be going to approach your parents about it, because your peer-to-peer type can produce what may be seen to be helpful advice, whereas you might be nervous about being judged by someone of an elder generation. And that's the sort of barrier we need to try and break down.
And why is it so important that this taboo is broken?
Well, I'll stop. Should I stop?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think it comes down to the fact that when you recognise that money and investments are not necessarily an end in them, they're not you know, the means that the end is about how you want to live your life, what your values are, can you be philanthropic with your money, what are your goals, over your lifetime. It's not just having a sort of, you know, an asset in my hands that is the goal. And I think once you can start talking about what it can do for you over the course of your life, then it becomes easier. And that's why I use the phrase values, to actually talk about the nitty-gritty of it. The danger is it just becomes a competition to see who has more money or less money, and that's where the judgment comes in. And that, I think, is a negative and unhealthy thing.
And to add to that, I think, we're seeing it with our client base that you have parents supporting children and also children supporting parents, especially elderly parents. And it makes things easier when that conversation has been had, or if both parties are talking as they're going through this journey. I, for one, have several clients who are trying to cover the care costs for elderly parents so the house doesn't go, for example. And there's an emotional attachment to the family home that's driving that decision. The other side, the flip side of it is, what does that mean for the children's finances later on and their children, so potentially the grandchildren in this scenario. So having those open, multi-generational conversations about money is really important. And I think the key is to take it step by step.
And we'll come on actually to some really practical advice on how to have those conversations, because I think that is important, isn't it? Because, I mean, what you described there in terms of looking at how the wealth kind of is going to trickle down, but also the concerns about how someone can protect themselves going forward, the fears of the older generation and the younger generation as to whether that older generation is going to be okay, and the emotional attachment. There's so much to unpick in those situations which are practical and deeply emotional at the same time.
Yeah, very true.
So can you think of a single downside of being open and talking about money?
I think the downside is if you talk about it too openly with the wrong sorts of people, there will be kind of league rankings. People will start to say, well, she's doing better than him, he's doing worse than her. And that is not what you want to do. So again, confiding in the right people. I mean, I don't think necessarily, we're not talking about here being more open means to tell everyone in the whole world about your wealth or your investments or whatever, but choosing a select group of people, hopefully including family and friends, close friends, I think can be very, very helpful. But I don't think you need to extend the net too widely. I mean, putting it out on TikTok and stuff is fine, but there may come a point where whoever does that may think, I need to just be a little bit more reticent.
Yeah, they're doing others a service to get conversations going, but we need to be mindful of protecting the privacy. And Tsitsi, there is research that indicates that people who are more open in having these good conversations around money actually feel more secure in it.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I see that all the time with the majority of people, and I think it's partly to do with the fact that they have gone through the journey over time. It's not a case of you have one conversation and that's it. We are constantly reviewing client situations, and I think as individuals we have to review our situations as well. And life happens, things change. 1 minute you're single, the next you're married. There's an opportunity for a conversation there, children come along. So on the flip side as well, because we're all human, some people who do have a lot of money are they're just not confident because of the fear, even though they're having those conversations. But I think when the emotions come in, we default to, to base settings, right? And those come from when we were younger, what our parents used to say to us, the sayings that we've heard all along. A famous one I keep hearing is, the more money, more problems. And for one person, it might mean that people are going to come and ask me for money all the time, so I'm not going to talk about my wealth. Or, I might become a target.
So when there is so much emotion caught up in our relationship with money, does it help to have someone impartial coming in and helping to have these conversations, like a financial advisor or anyone else?
I think that's one of the best ways to try and take some of the subjectivity out of it and become more objective. So an outside advisor is very, very important. But let's go back a bit further. I mean, I think one of the issues here is financial literacy. In other words, how are people taught to think about money, and again, connecting it with their values and their goals. And it's interesting to me, and I mean, it's a serious point. I mean, schools are very good at teaching other taboo subjects like sex education, but they're not very good at money education and financial education. And so it occurs to me that we need to make sure that the people who are sort of growing up and coming into the workforce and have a much better sense, I think, of understanding of and appreciation of money. And it's not just about adding up. I think that's a mistake to think it's just simply, oh, can you do your sums? I think it's a lot. It's much more three-dimensional than that. And I think that's where maybe we need to be as helpful as we can. And the investment advisors clearly are also a very important part of that. If
you could tell every parent out there, everyone who has younger people in their life, what would be the best thing to say and when to start saying it in order to sort of change that dynamic that you've just been described about, that squeamishness around maths and money from early on?
Well, from a behavioural point of view, the most important thing is trying to create good habits early. And what does a habit mean? It means consistency. It means doing the right thing little and often. So it's not about big gestures or grand plans. It's about, for example, can you have conversations with your offspring that allow you to teach them that you, and indeed you encourage them to do the same thing, which is to save a little bit. And again, mindful of all the things that the bills and things we all have to pay, whatever age we are. Can you ingrain some of those small habits? So ISAs, for example, or savings plans, or are there little things you can do, including the importance of budgeting, to help people understand. And again, I think that's a conversation that can be had with children at the right level, around the breakfast table, in a sort of friendly, informal way that just instills some of the right ideas early on.
To be able to have those conversations, though, Tsitsi, do you have to be good at it yourself?
I don't think so. I had that conversation with my daughter before she went to university, and it was a disaster. She did everything I told her not to do. But again, it was a conversation about don't do this, and actually not about what happens when things go wrong. Yeah. How can you get out of it? But you know, to answer the question, I think you don't necessarily have to know all the answers. But within your network, whether it's family, so cousins, aunts, uncles, someone will know somebody who might know about mortgages, for example, and then investments. Or there might be someone within the family who is known to be really good at saving. So why not ask them to have that conversation? And if you're in the room, it's also a learning opportunity for you. One thing I did, just going back to the ISA point, I actually said to my cousins that I wanted to give my nieces and nephews money for Christmas, but I wanted it to go into a junior ISA. And for me, it was my way of getting my cousins to start talking to their children about money in their own way. You know, but I'm sort of facilitating this idea in the hope that they will also say, you know, let's start saving for the children as well.
And did it work?
For one, it did. The others, I'm the one having the conversations. But over time, you know, I'm seeing, you know, one of my cousins is now becoming a part of that conversation and actually wanting to know more about investing, etc. So, I think it's definitely a multi-pronged thing. Yes, the schools have got a part to play. Parents have a part to play, but I think society as well has got a huge part to play.
I like that idea of, I mean, it takes a village, yes, isn't it? Just looking around at who else is in the arena who can step in and help.
Absolutely. I think we've got that, and actually the difference between the village where you have people around you who may be able to step in and provide guidance. The flip side is, of course, the danger is with something like social media, where there are so-called experts everywhere from you know, across on the other side of the planet that are telling you to buy, you know, Bitcoin or whatever it may be. Now that's fine, and I think the danger is we've got to try and. I think one of the lessons for anybody involved in investment, whatever age you are, but assuming this is focused on the younger generation, the importance of time and the importance of longer term objectives, because this isn't all about short term gratification. And of course, so much of social media is about short term gratification. This is about investing. So, the question that you could ask yourself is, if you could put away something today in an envelope and pick it up in 20 or 30 years' time, what would it be? And history suggests it might have something to do with stocks and shares or something, hence the ISA advice. You're giving yourself a gift in the future. You probably wouldn't put simple cash into it. You'd probably have a stake of the stock market. And so these sorts of ideas, and I'm always reminded of one of my favourite phrases about investment, but I think people get it. It's not about investment at all, but it is. There are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots. And the idea behind that is, don't think you can whiz everything into some whizzy investment at an early age and think that's the end and it'll always work. I mean, be sensible for the long term.
I read something about Warren Buffett the other day talking about how his enormous wealth came later in life, where there was the kind of
compounding.
Yes. And that's something, it kind of sounds boring and hard to understand, but it's when you see practical examples of the difference it makes. I guess that's the stuff that fires up an interest in playing a longer game. So can you talk a bit about that? Well,
it is. Einstein, who is the most misquoted person on the internet, he'd never said this, but look it up, everyone thinks he did, about compound interest being the most powerful force on the planet. No, he didn't say that. But the sentiment is pretty accurate. And if you can have the luxury of back to my point about little and often early on, consistency of savings plans, through a wealth advisor, however you want to do it, then over time that does gather, and that compounding creates something that you hope would look sort of reasonably exponential. And that, I think, is the message from me, again, going back to this taboo about money, is if you can get that message across and break the taboo with that sort of sensible long-term advice, that to me is, I thankfully did receive some of that advice when I was much younger, but I wish I'd had it more instilled into me, because it's good advice then, and I'm sure it'd be good advice for those taking it now for 20 or 30 or 40 years' time. So
it's never too early, but it's also never too late, is that?
100%. There's never a right time. It's just, when the time is there, just take it and go over whatever you can in that moment. I think also sometimes when we get new information, we want to share all of it at one go, and sometimes the recipient isn't ready because they haven't reached that place. They're at step 1, you're on number 10, and you're trying to pull them along. So I think there is, we have to be cognizant about allowing people to catch up with us as well.
And the little and often, is there a too little? Because that's also a barrier, isn't it, to sort of stepping on that path of saving? Well, what's the value of me putting that tiny amount aside?
That I think
I can afford.
That's a really interesting question, and I think the again, it depends on the age of someone who's doing it. But in my view, based on my experience and looking at some of the behavioural stuff I've seen, it's about creating this idea of habits.
Okay.
And if you can start small, you can then increase it over the period of time. But it's getting into the habit of doing the right thing. So I don't think at an early age there is such a thing as too small a saving or too small an investment. It's about understanding the habitual nature of it. And once you get into the habit, it will later become very powerful and very beneficial.
Yeah, to add to that, I think we do that very thing that Paul's talking about when we decide to go to the gym. You start very small, and build up that strength and the energy and then the habit and then the mental capacity, and suddenly your brain is saying, you know what, I can do this. I can run on the... And enjoy it, exactly. And it's exactly the same thing with money. When I started saving, it was just put £5 away every month. And then suddenly I was like, I can put 20. And then now I'm saying I'm going to put X% of my salary away it wasn't even difficult. It was just about that consistency and linking it back to my values. What are the goals? What do I want to do? What do I want this money to do for me, for my family, etc. It took time. I can talk about it now in like 30 seconds, but it took a couple of years to get from the one amount to the next. But after that, it just becomes second nature.
From a behavioural science point of view, what's actually happening here in terms of creating a habit is actually you're allowing, it's becoming part of your unconscious decision making. Because initially when you start, I have to consciously decide I will put some money away, and you'll start rationalising, oh no, I might need that money for this. Oh dear, should I miss it this month or whatever it may be. And there may be perfectly good reasons why you should or should do these things. But creating a habit is about doing something and putting it into the unconscious mind, which is a very powerful motivator for anything. It is how real people make real decisions in the real world. It's mostly unconscious. So if unconsciously you get used to the idea of saving, which is done through repetition or investing, then after a while it becomes easy, like going to the gym or whatever it is your goal is.
And when does it stop winking at you as something that you can easily dip into if you suddenly decide there's some pressing need for it?
Well, no one is saying you should just do it automatically like a robot. We're not saying that, because there may be times or circumstances change where you might need to say dip into your savings or whatever, and that's well and good. And indeed, no one is saying you shouldn't do that, but you need to have that pot in the first place to dip into. So let's start early and build it up. Then you can always override it, but you shouldn't be an automaton. But it's a good way to start a good habit.
So I said we'd talk about specifics on how to have these conversations, and we've already touched on a couple of things. One, the kind of having the third party is a good thing, and the sort of extension of that was bringing in people around you who can also perhaps give advice that you're not able to give yourself. What are your other good tips for how to start these conversations that can be difficult to broach, Tsitsi?
I think the first one for me is, set actual time aside for the conversation. And then the second thing is not to make it such a heavy subject. And it doesn't have to be about, let's talk about wills today, or, or inheritance tax. But, those small things that happen every day. And it also depends on the age of the person and circumstances. I think I'd start off with those two.
So when you say the age of the person, say it's a group of siblings or one offspring wanting to have a conversation with parents about, we don't know what's going on, whether you're planning to downsize, how this is going to work at some point. It's a very delicate one. How would you suggest that?
Yeah, without knowing the family, because it's so nuanced. But I guess there's several ways that I might tackle it. The parent might have a friend who's going through something similar, or they've downsized, right?
Yeah.
So using someone else's situation as a discussion point, and then weaving in, the actual situation you want to talk about, I think, is one way of broaching the subject in a really soft way. Unfortunately, for some families, it takes a disaster to happen for some, conversations to start. So I think trying to bring in, what you've seen, and even simple things like if you're all sitting watching TV and there's a scenario that plays out on TV, and having a discussion about that can then start bringing in the ideas to people's heads.
Yeah, I mean, no one ever made a decision because of a number. They make it because of a story.
Yes.
And I think hence, referencing back something I said earlier about goals and values and stuff, those all can be created in stories. And I like the idea of I'm not sure I could ever interrupt my children when they're watching TV, but sort of round a table, round a meal table. And again, it's not about throwing spreadsheets at them or that sort of thing. I really would, be against that idea, because I think that might become later on. But just sort of creating the right images, the right stories about what could or should happen, or you want to happen, and asking questions of them. And again, can start that at an early age, and see where that goes. But I think that allows you to bring up to break this taboo.
Yeah.
Because what do you want? What are your goals? What are your expectations? And as they become teenagers and beyond, you might traditionally ask them that about their A levels or whatever it is, their education goals, but then widen the conversation. And I don't think it's as difficult as it may sound. I think that's actually not a bad one. I mean, I've got 3 boys, 30, 27, 25 now, and we had those conversations. Again, don't think it was very boring in our house. So we didn't just talk about money. Not quite the opposite. We didn't. But as they got older, they just became more aware of what I was trying to do, and I tried to shift it on what they wanted to do over the time, and I felt that was helpful, and I feel that's certainly where they are now in terms of what they're doing and saving, and I hope they seem to have appreciated it.
It's that thing that we've been talking about, which is it is empowering to be able to have the understanding and for it to be like just a normal topic of conversation, a normal thing that we think about.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when I chat with them, and one sort of talks to them and their friends and their peers and things occasionally, and I am aware that some families are very good at doing it, and other families it's just never discussed this money issue. Yeah. I think I'd rather err on the side of being a little bit too open or transparent with them than being, than them waking up one day and finding out their parents are dead and opening a will kind of thing. Yeah. You see what I'm saying? I'd rather they know things in advance. Yeah.
So on that then, I thought it might be helpful to talk about some of the specific things that should be talked about, and that's the big one, I guess, the legacy plan.
Yep. Yeah. So I think Paul's mentioned the will. Just going back to your previous question, most of the time it's not about money.
Yeah.
So money is just what is the result of some action. So discussion points I think people focus so much on money. We must talk about money, but it's actually not about money. So this is where talking about the wills is really important. Is there will in place, power of attorney as well? Mm-hmm. And I'll share a story about a neighbour of mine who fell ill suddenly. The wife couldn't access any of the assets because there wasn't a power of attorney in place. They're very young. These are not elderly people. So it's those sort of things that we need to just normalize and have them in place, because we just don't know what's going to happen. I think also the budgeting for young, well, we say younger people, but I think sometimes older people also need, to go through a bit of a budgeting exercise, but just understanding how money is being spent and whether people need more money, and how they can potentially get that. We're living in an environment where inflation is quite high. How is the younger generation managing, and how are the older generation? Is the older generation actually helping the younger generation to navigate this challenging time, and what's the impact on the older generation if they continue doing this? Yeah.
And when you said about, obviously it's a continuous theme through this conversation, the emotional side of all of this. And when you were talking there about wills, it reminded me of something I read many years ago, which was someone talking about what happened in her family when she was effectively cut out of the will because the parent had a perspective that she was doing very well financially, so she didn't need the money, and decided to give it to the other sibling who was not in the same league. And actually it was so emotionally difficult for this woman then to lose the parent and also have to deal with that. And even though she could understand why that choice had been taken, because there'd not been a conversation, it became an awful thing to deal with in the event of a death. I guess if you're thinking one way, this would be the logical way to divide my assets later or whatever. Again, there's probably no downside of having that conversation and seeing how it might land.
Yeah, definitely not. There's so many stories about how either not having a will or not having a discussion about the will has caused rifts in families. Yeah. And it's sad to see, because sometimes it is literally about just having a dinner together and just saying, these are my wishes, this is what I've put in place. But yeah, more often than not, you do see that. And just linked to that, we see some scenarios where there hasn't been enough financial planning done. And it's left to those who, the survivors, to deal with things like paying inheritance tax. And, there's a huge inheritance tax bill. Why didn't he or she put things in place? And this would be someone who's actually quite financially savvy and has probably been helping everybody else in the family with their finances. But when it came to theirs, they didn't do this one thing, which causes a lot of issues for the family, and people are left wondering why.
You were saying earlier about the word that I can't pronounce either, but the Scandinavian word for shame with finances. It reminded me also of there's another Scandinavian concept, Swedish death cleaning. It's called, and I don't know the word, but it's actually about the practical clear outs, and it's about sort of being kind to the next generation, so they don't have to deal with everything that's in a home, the accumulation of stuff over many years. And it's a thing, like from the age of 65, you start to think about, okay, now I'm downsizing, now I'm decluttering, as for myself, but also as an act of love for the next generation.
Yep.
Is that, I mean, does that kind of play into what your sense of the ongoing impact of what people do and how they talk about money?
Yeah, and I think again, it's almost a taboo thing. It's quite hard to say to. Well, it might in certain circumstances, or some families will say, "Listen, I'm clearing out this junk before I go," but that's effectively what you're doing.
Yeah.
And in the same way that decluttering, tidying up your house, downsizing. Tidying up your finances is just as important, and for me, tidying up my finances means having a good will. I mean, having a will that makes sense, and because I think it's fair to say if you die intestate without a will, that's going to cause so many potential family frictions, and lawyers getting involved and everything getting nasty. Whereas if it's all clear and you've done your tidying up, if you like, you've done all you can do.
Yeah.
And I guess also consider whether it can be challenged, because that's something obviously that
Absolutely.
is often an issue.
Yeah.
And then the practical things you mentioned, power of attorney, where documents are.
Yeah. Where the documents, where are the passwords? In this day and age, it's all about passwords. If I think about myself, everything is online. I don't have any bills coming through the door. So where are the passwords? Who do you bank with? And it's not about giving someone access. It's just so that they know. And I believe there's actually a book that you can get where you can list all these things down. I'll have to get the name of it. And it's all about, when you die, everything is in this book. I think you can get it off Amazon. But I think it's just, and it's that idea of, tidying things up for the next generation. Talking to a financial advisor as well is a good thing to do at least once in your life. So maybe as you get closer to retirement, because all these questions come up: do you have a will? Do you have a power of attorney? What are your plans for care if you have to pay care costs? What are your thoughts about passing on your wealth to the next generation, and the timing? And all of those things feed back into your last wishes. If you do have young children, if the worst does happen and you're no longer here, what are your wishes for your children? Who would you want to look after them, and how would you want them to be looked after? So there's a lot more that people in the financial services industry do than just talk about. Money is actually the last thing we talk about, because we have to establish what are your values, what are your goals, exactly what Paul said in the beginning, who should be in this conversation with us.
Yeah.
And then, the money bit is the easy bit.
So not easy to have these conversations, but better than the alternative, which is what happens if you don't have them.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a case of, a lot of this is common sense, but it's easy to say that. It actually comes down to going back to some of these ideas about financial literacy. We talked about the building blocks, just being aware of what you want to do as if you're leaving money, if you want to have goals, what do you want to do if you're saving money. And I think, some of us we assume that everyone else knows what they're doing, and they don't, and that's why these conversations are worth having, whether about life or death, around a table, if you can have an open conversation, particularly with your loved ones. I don't think it should be as embarrassing as traditionally it may have been.
Yeah. Got lots of questions coming in, so I'll put some of them to you. We don't have any children, but instead plan to leave our inheritance to our nieces and nephews. How do I approach talking about wealth with children who are not mine? If my parents don't speak about money or inheritance as it's none of my business, what should I at least ensure they have? Oh no, that's the second question. They look like they were running into each other.
Okay.
So we'll stick them with the, how do you talk about wealth with children who aren't yours? You kind of said a bit about that, didn't you?
It's about age, so not knowing the age. I guess the simplest thing is when you are around them, if you're doing something together,
yes,
that you can link to either, not necessarily maybe the discussion about, because you have to introduce this idea. So just to talk about money, talk about wealth. And I think the first thing with anyone who you're thinking of passing assets down to is really understanding what their goals are. And I think that's an easy way to bring in the money thing. So if it's someone who hasn't gone to university yet, are they planning on going to university? Which sort of university? What are they thinking of doing? And then maybe a conversation later on about how you might be able to assist them now or later on, or, I mean, my daughter, I don't know where she's going to live in this world. She might live in Korea because she loves Korea. And so, I have to think about that when I'm considering passing down in anything to her. So it's about, I guess, the more you know the children in this case, then thinking about what are their interests and how can we start weaving those interests into what we are planning for later on in life.
I think it's a really good question, and again, without knowing the circumstances, I mean, it's not really for me to advise. But one thing I would say, is it might be worth thinking about. Well, is it worth putting money aside for them for a particular goals? Again, if you've talked to them, even better. So, for example, maybe towards the cost of the wedding or children's education or something specific, rather than just leaving them a bunch of money. And again, everyone must do their own thing, but that might be a helpful way to have a conversation with them when they're younger.
Yeah, and to have that conversation with the parents also,
and particularly with the parents. Sorry, we don't know the age, but that to me would be a good way of doing it, rather than just leaving a block of money necessarily where you might worry about what they're going to do with it, whatever. Actually allocate it. Or some trust, or however it's done, but that would strike me as being a good way to approach them.
Yeah. So on to that question I started reading prematurely. If my parents don't speak about money or inheritance as it's none of my business, what should I at least ensure they have in place for my own peace of mind?
Yeah, again, it's the sort of the will, the power of attorney.
Power of attorney before
I feel like power of attorney, actually, we tend to say get them done at the same time.
Yeah.
Because the power of attorney works whilst the individual is alive.
Yes.
And that's normally where we as, wealth managers get to meet some of these children. It's like, the parent can't deal with their finances now, or, they're ill. And suddenly this person comes and says, I'm the child. So I think the power of attorney definitely is very important, and the will. And again, in those sort of scenarios, it's about looking at, maybe the community or the people around you who is in a similar situation, and what have they done, and can you use that as a conversation starter with your parent. Or maybe get that family to come and have a conversation if possible. Otherwise, sometimes it's about saying, I came across this little pamphlet and maybe you should have a read of it. It is definitely a difficult one. I come from a culture where if you talk to wills about certain people, to certain people, they'll think you're trying to kill them, and they'll say it to your face. So it's, and it's a real fear that some people have, and I think it's important not to discount.
Well, it sounds like
that.
you're thinking about that person dying, which isn't.
That's not. So you have to go through again. It's about chipping away little and often. And hopefully, eventually, they'll come round and something can be done.
Yeah. You came straight in with power of attorney.
It's a personal example where a few years ago, I talked to my mother about it, and had power of attorney over her for health and finance. Yeah. And then not long afterwards, she developed dementia, and she's still going strong. Yeah. It's a different conversation I have to have with her these days than I used to have in the old days, but in terms of making sure that she's comfortable and happy and okay, it's been a lot easier with me having the power of attorney than if it had suddenly happened and there was no preparation.
Yeah.
So she's well looked after. She's in a very good place in a home, and but that made a huge difference, absolutely huge difference.
Yeah.
And if we hadn't done it, it would have been tough, very tough.
Is it something to be kind of nervous about if someone says to you, right, I want to give you power of attorney, and you're a bit worried about whether you have the capability to do that?
Well, I thought the question you were going to ask me then was what's going to happen if your son rings you up and says, "Can I, power of attorney?
Yeah.
Dad, hurry up." What is it?
Yeah. Okay. So both perspectives then.
But doesn't this come back to the whole thing of we should be able to talk about this and even have a laugh about it. And again, one doesn't want to be flippant about things like death or dementia, or whatever. But in the sense of you can actually have an easier conversation earlier on about these difficult, sad issues, which you can't have actually when it gets, near the time.
Yeah.
So again, I encourage, I listen. I'm the only way I can advise is what I've done, and I've tried to have some of these conversations with my kids. Yeah. And in fact, my parents were pretty good with me as well. So again, it's learning from others.
Do you have any thoughts on how to empower your children on managing wealth versus dictating to them? I like the undercurrent of that question. I know what I want my kids to do with money. How do I manage to make them do it without being clear?
I'll try and answer that, because I think I experienced that with my daughter when she went to university. I told her exactly what not to do, and she went and did it anyway. But what I learned from that was she had to kind of make some of these mistakes and also be allowed to take whatever steps she felt were right for her, so that she could learn the right thing. Sometimes, we learn by doing. Others can learn by just being told, and they will understand the whole thing. Others need to read. For some it's, social media, watch a webinar and go to classes, etc. So I think the first thing is understand your child or the children and allow them to learn. So it might be a case, if they're younger, giving them some money, see how they manage that money, etc. And it all boils down to, what Paul said right at the beginning, understand their values, what are their goals. And these change, obviously, over time, as we know ourselves, and just being with them along that journey. And obviously, as they get older, introduce them to maybe experts in certain areas, so that when it's time for them to, when they're thinking about buying a house, for example.
I love the idea of you saying, don't do this. It's like saying, don't think of a pink polar bear.
Yes, exactly. Well, I didn't even know that that's what would happen. But this is what happens. And, I'm the person who works in financial services, right?
There's a quote on the wall of this room, actually, which I like, which is one of the most, the most dangerous phrase in our language is, we've always done it this way. And that just came into my mind when you were saying that. About, obviously, it's painful when we see our loved ones making mistakes that we just wish we could kind of guide them away from. But also it's important to remember that thing that, as you just were saying, things change over time, and we don't have the monopoly. They might have a much better idea of what to do with the money, and so it's important to listen in that context too, isn't it?
Definitely, and I think I did make the point of saying earlier, ask questions. And because for me, the real insights often come from asking sort of almost Socratic questions of one's children, what their intentions and ambitions are, and you'll learn a lot more than if you tell them what to do. I think, especially, and then the other related piece of thing is if you can show them rather than tell them, show them what you're doing, assuming that what you're doing you're reasonably pleased to show them how you're saving money or investing or why you think that's important. I think then you have a better chance of helping them. And again, it doesn't mean that we've got it right ourselves. Quite the opposite. But at least if they're watching what we're doing and we get it wrong, they can learn from that.
Yes, and laugh at us.
And laugh at us.
Exactly.
And why not?
Is it better to gift wealth in small chunks over time, or leave it as a big bang inheritance? Who wants to?
Well, can I?
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, I think you touched
because
on
I have
it
some
earlier,
experience. Sorry, I have some experience of it. I think it comes back to my little and often idea. small. I would go for the small chunks because I think then. Let me tell you why. I think if, as the giver, you might feel more comfortable with the idea that it won't all get, quotes, blown, on something amazing as far as the receiver of the gift is concerned. Brackets wasted. And we all have in our lives milestones or whatever you want to call them, and university, partner, marriage, whatever it may be, kids maybe, whatever, house. And so I think that if you think of life in terms of those milestones, then the concept of chunks of money as opposed to a big dollop at the beginning, I think would be more useful to someone like me if I was receiving it, because I would be more sensible with it potentially.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's fair.
Yeah, it all depends, I completely agree with Paul. And also the beauty of doing it that way is you actually get to see what the recipient uses that money for whilst you're alive, and I think you get a certain sense of satisfaction from that and being a part of maybe that decision. You see it a lot when grandparents give, some money to help to the grandchildren get on the property ladder, etc. But the flip side of that is, you have to understand the impact it will have on you now and in the future. And that's where, getting some sort of advice on how to do these gifts either regularly or whether the lump sum is the right thing for you. I think it's really important to just go through that exercise and have a discussion with somebody about that. But certainly a lot of people benefit from the fact that they can give money now, see how it's being used, and also get the thanks there and there, see the reaction from the person they're giving the money to.
I'm keen to give my children a head start in life, but I'm concerned that once empowered, a couple of bad decisions early on could undo all my hard work. Therefore, is there any benefit of investing in a junior ISA and maintaining oversight once they turn 18, or should I be investing in a junior SIP? Who's for that? Who's that one for?
Wow. Again, it's one of those things where I'm going to be like, it all depends. But I'll tell you a quick funny story about a junior ISA. So I was looking after a junior ISA for a child at the time. And when they turned 18, the parents, I had to get him to sign some forms, etc. And the parents said, yeah, come over to the house. And they told him about this money the day I arrived in the kitchen, like 2 seconds, and then left him on the dining room table with me in the dining room to tell him about this whole account, this money. And for me, I felt, what would have that experience been like for him if they had taken him on that journey with the junior ISA? One, two, what were the reasons for them not sharing that with him? I mean, he's very good with the account. So
I was going to ask, how was he responding? I mean, was he like?
When they turned 18, so he was 18 at that. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, he was a bit surprised because it was all kind of.
I've got this money to spend on whatever I like, or was he kind of presumably not that sensitive?
No, and to the person who's asked that question, you'd be surprised how children at 18, not that they don't know what to do with the money, but they don't think about blowing the money, because I think now, everyone, when they're gifted something, thinks about, the thought behind it. Why would someone start this up for me and keep contributing? And you always want to have something tangible with that money. But I think it is possible to keep oversight. However, the main account holder will be the child in particular. So again, I love junior ISAs because they're a wonderful conversation starter with the next generation. And even if you go the pension route, it's a wonderful way to start off that conversation, and also to teach them the habits about investing. There's so much in there. So I guess it's a question of how soon do you want them to get access to the money? And again, how much do you trust them? So
I think we've got time for a couple of quick questions. How do you help children feel they still need to make their own way whilst at the time discussing potentially large financial gifts and inheritance?
I think in the spirit of transparency and openness, sorry, it's a bit of a sort of fluffy, non-meaning answer, but I think the better the communication and the more honest the relationship, that's sort of the first bit. And the second bit is, I think I go back to this idea of show, not tell. In other words, if you've set a reasonable example yourself, you hope, and that's all you can do. You can hope that they'll
if someone knows quite early on they're going to be coming into a huge amount of money at a later point, might that change their life ambition on what they might do if they were thinking otherwise they really have to financially make their own way?
It's possible. I mean, one thing I've found is every family, however wealthy they are, has got a story. How did this money come to being? And it's always come from someone working hard, someone making a decision that they were going to do something and they reaped the rewards from it. And, you know, for some, their families, their extended family has been reaping the rewards for centuries. So it's about talking about those stories, you know. There's so much power in storytelling. You know, we are here today because of X, Y, Z, and bringing in that theme about hard work. You know, you can easily bring in a theme about hard work from there.
There's an interview I saw, I think it was on TV a year or so ago, about a guy called Francis Fulford who owns a 10,000-acre farm in Devon, and it's been in the family for back to the 13th century, so that's, what is it, 800 years. And I say this in the context of some of the comments we made. He was asked how on earth they'd managed to keep the house going for 800 years in the same family. And he said, well, when I go back to my ancestors, we've had loads of idiots. We've had drunken idiots, we've had gambling idiots, philandering idiots, idiots who get in prison for treason, he said, but we've never had two idiots in a row. So, you know, there's a serious point in there, by the way, is that you just hope that you can impart some common sense to the next generation, because after that you haven't got a clue.
Okay, a last question. I'm next of kin to one of my siblings who's come into a lottery-size win. I'm almost scared to speak about money in case she thinks I want her to give me some. However, I recognise she needs help and advice. How can I broach it?
Maybe send the link for this webinar. You know, I think there's so much information out there, and we all share information with each other. But sometimes we're not strategic about the information we share. So it might be a case of sending a link to a webinar that you've watched, or inviting that person to an event and having a discussion about that. But understanding that you're not going to have the conversation that you want to have with that individual there and then. It might take a couple of months before you actually have that conversation.
So, final point then from both of you. What would you want someone to take away from as the golden nugget from what we've been talking about today?
I would say start the conversation now. Wherever you are, just start.
Yeah, I think start early, try and develop good habits that can be consistently repeated, and watch and listen. Try and get as many different perspectives as possible on it.
Yeah.
You know, a change in perspective is probably worth 80 IQ points, as Alan Kay once said. And I think that's once you are able to have those 2 or 3 different perspectives on something, you'll be in a much better position to make a decision. But Tolstoy, time and patience. They're the great warriors, time and patience. And I think if we're talking to people who are younger rather than older, they can be 2 great allies.
I like that. Thank you both very much indeed. It's been great to hear your wisdom, and thank you very much for joining us also today. I hope that's been helpful and interesting for you, and do join us for our next webinar in this series. It's on the 7th of June, Wednesday the 7th of June, and it's How Do You Achieve Financial Wellbeing? Prevention is Better Than Cure. I do hope that we'll see you then, and we'll be sending a link to register to that webinar in the follow-up email from today, with links also to previous conversations and guides. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.